At this point, everyone knows about Zora, and if you don't, let me give you the spark notes really quickly. They're usually blue, they have awesome shark-like fins on their elbows and heads, and they're the rudest race in Hyrule. Now that we're on the same page, I want to ask a really important question. Since Zora were one of the earliest races in Hyrule, and the bird-like people known as the Rito evolved from Zora during the Great Flood that preceded the Wind Waker, then did the Zora re-evolve from Rito before Breath of the Wild? You know, because suddenly Zora were back in Hyrule during the events of Breath in the Wild, which takes place in the far futures. Okay, that question was a bit confusing, especially if you don't remember how many different timelines there are in Zelda. Let me quickly break it down. Whenever you play a Zelda game, you're going through a story that takes place in one of 3 different timelines. They're called 1. The Child Timeline, 2. The Adult Timeline, and 3. The Fallen Hero Timeline. Now, all of these are sprung from the events of Ocarina of Time, which makes a ton of sense if you think about it, because that game featured Link time hopping through the Temple of Time. He effectively was branching off different universes every time he traveled the 7-year gap. Now, how do each of these timelines affect the evolution of the Zora? Remember, the main question here is whether or not the Zora re-evolved into the water-dwelling species after having first evolved into Rito. Because in general, we know that in the beginning, Zora existed. At that time, there were no Rito, zero, zilch. Later, in some timelines, the Zora were said to have gone extinct after evolving into Rito. So how then did the Breath of the Wild Zora come about? You know, because as I mentioned earlier, they had already evolved into the bird-like Rito at this point. So for this question to be posed, we have to figure out which of these 3 timelines does Breath of the Wild belong to. It's already been confirmed that Breath of the Wild is a far future version of Hyrule, so whichever timeline it occupies, it's probably the last game in the respective series, chronologically speaking. So let's go ahead and break down the timelines one by one to see where it might fit. The Child Timeline imagines a universe where young Link in the Ocarina of Time successfully warned the royal family before Ganondorf had a chance to destroy the world, and therefore avoided all of the calamity in the next 7 years. In this universe, young Link went on an adventure to the foreign land of Termina in Majora's Mask, and then much later, a resurrected Link saved Hyrule and the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess. Now, did you notice anything missing from this timeline? There's no Great Flood, which means there's no chance for the Zora to evolve into Rito, which then means this is likely not the same universe as Breath of the Wild. Supposing, of course, that they didn't have a chance or evolutionary reason to evolve in the events after Twilight Princess, of course. Now, let's be honest, the Zelda team doesn't really design their games with story canon on the front of their minds. So I think as we're going through this, the simplest answer is often the best one. And in this situation, if there were no Rito in this timeline, then we can probably safely claim that this is not the same timeline as Breath of the Wild. On to the second one, the Fallen Hero Timeline. In this one, we see a world where Link failed to thwart Ganondorf, and the evil sorcerer has taken his Triforce of Courage and also Zelda's Triforce of Wisdom. This timeline is basically a catch-all for the rest of the games that don't fit neatly into either the child or adult timelines, including the original Legend of Zelda. And yet again, for those paying attention, there is no Great Flood in the Fallen Hero timeline, which means the Zoras didn't get a chance to evolve into Rito, probably. Since again there's no evidence of evolution, I'm going to be a smart little scientist, or at least a pretend scientist for the sake of this video, and go with a timeline that has ample amounts of evidence. This leaves us with the adult timeline. In this third universe, Link defeated Ganondorf in the events of Ocarina of Time, but when traveling back through the temporal portal, he became lost. And with him gone, the Triforce of Courage was shattered into 8 pieces and cast about Hyrule. And you know what else? Do you really want to know what else? Well, guess what? There was a Great Flood. A deluge of mythical proportions. And do you know what else happened? Well, you probably guessed it. The Zora evolved. Unable to survive in the foul water of the flood, which came about from evil forces, the Zora came to land. They made their home on Dragon Roost Island, a sandy, small archipelago in the northeast region of the Great Sea. The island was home to the great dragon Valu and an entire network of magma veins, which all connected to a great volcano. Here, the Zora culture transformed. Their art, their music, their spirituality, all of it was originally derived from life in deep lakes, rivers, and seas, but here they looked to the skies. And so, even their bodies changed, sprouting great wings and beaks instead of fins. It's said that there were no Zora remaining after the events of the Wind Waker. They all had evolved into Rito. Since there are Rito in this timeline, and Rito also in the Breath of the Wild, then I'm going to guess that they belong to the same exact one, the same exact timeline. And now we can finally go back full circle and answer the question at hand. Since there were no Zora left in Hyrule after the Great Flood, and since Breath of the Wild takes place at least 10,000 years after the Wind Waker, then how did the Zora race reappear in Breath of the Wild? Evolution is obviously an established scientific theory in the Zelda universe, so the Zora probably evolved from something. So the question again is, did the Zora from Breath of the Wild re-evolve from Rito? As opposed to, some other type of humanoid or fish? If we look at the Zora of Breath of the Wild, they look totally different than any other previous version we've seen. Each member of the species has a unique appearance, some are similar to hammerhead sharks, while others are reminiscent of whales or stingrays. Even though the Zora were always pretty diverse, especially their king, it's even more pronounced in Breath of the Wild. Which makes me wonder if they actually ever evolved at all in the Breath of the Wild. For them to have such wildly different features, then perhaps they were just created. It wouldn't be the first time beings were given life in the Zelda universe. But then again, the Zora of other timelines were really different, they were diverse. There were actually separate species too, like the River Zora, which had completely different physical traits than what you'd expect. Not all species in Zelda are as uniform as Hylians or Rito. I guess if I were to think about it again, I guess I would lean towards the idea that these were indeed descendants of Rito who evolved into Zora. But then there's another question. If the Zora went extinct in the Great Flood, then the creature that we now call Zora in the Breath of the Wild aren't Zora at all. They're completely different types of creatures, right? If you really think about it, they just so happen to benefit from the same type of convergent evolution, meaning that their bodies adapted to life in the water, so the modern Zora of Breath of the Wild and the ancient Zora of Ocarina of Time look the same. So if we call the Zora from Breath of the Wild Zora, that'd be like calling a parakeet a pterodactyl. Just because they evolved the same features doesn't mean that they're the same species. Or, perhaps I'm thinking about this too deeply, or, perhaps I'm thinking about it too lightly, because I obviously have no idea what I'm talking about and no idea about evolution. But in the matter at hand, again, that's whether or not the Zora of Breath of the Wild evolved from the avian race of Rito, who themselves evolved from Zora over 10,000 years ago. I'm going to say, yeah, I really think they did. I think that the Zora from Breath of the Wild are 100% related to the Rito of Wind Waker. Thanks for giving this a listen, guys. If you thought this video was not half bad, please consider subscribing to this channel and, maybe even leaving a like or a comment below. I'm really trying to grow it, and all the attention, all the likes, all the subscribes, all the comments, it really helps me pop up into the YouTube algorithm a bit more, and it, just helps me stay motivated. Thanks again. Check out another video if you want, or, get out there, enjoy the day, go for a walk. Catch you guys next time.